Tech Fit Tech. In this video I am putting the Canon EOS R6 through its paces in what we are now calling the Cloud Palace. Until you come up with a better name, that's the new name for the flat. Canon UK kindly loaned me the R6 for 2 weeks, and in that time I shot 24,957 photos with it. And in this video I'm going to be sharing with you my findings, everything from usability to battery life to quality of time lapses, etc. So let's begin. Hello and welcome back to my channel. In case you're new here, my name is Vandeputte. My channel is tutorials. Quick disclaimer before we begin. Yes, Canon UK loaned me this camera. There is, however, no contract and they have had zero input in this video whatsoever. Secondly, Patreon supporters and channel members will get access to RAW files and time-lapse sequences that I recorded with this camera. So, let's begin. As always, there's plenty of other reviewers out there that talk about the performance of cameras, etc., but I always review them from the eyes of a time-lapse photographer, so let's talk about the specs that are relevant to time-lapse photography. First up, the sensor. This is a full-frame mirrorless camera with 20.1 million pixels and a Digic X processor. This is very similar to the current flagship, the 1DX Mark III. The R6 produces 14-bit CR3 RAW files. It also produces compressed RAW files, which we'll talk about later because they're super interesting. HEIF files, H-E-I-F, and the classic 8-bit JPEG files. The R6 features time-lapse video mode as well as intervalometer mode in photo mode. The video time-lapse mode has a holy grail setting where it gradually adjusts the exposure as the sun sets or rises, so you get a smooth flicker-free video file. More about that later. The full flip and touchscreen is super useful for your odd angles. There's a 2.5mm jack input for external remotes. There are 2 SD card slots on the side, and this camera charges over USB-C using the USB PD or power delivery protocol. Alrighty, chapter 1, how to set up a time-lapse in photo mode. Time-lapse photo mode you will find in the red menus has a minimum interval of 1 second and a maximum interval of 99 hours, 59 minutes and 59 seconds. In this mode, you have to disable back button focus if you have that on. A lot of time-lapse photographers like myself have the shutter function and the focus function separated from the shutter button. This is a bug. This has to go, this has to get fixed because currently the camera pretends to fire when back button focus is on and you're using the built-in intervalometer, however it doesn't. So keep that in mind when you're using this camera and you're one of the people that use back button autofocus. To shoot a holy grail time-lapse in photo mode, you either shoot fully manual, as I teach in this video where you adjust it along the way, or using an external bulb ramper or controlling device, or switch to aperture priority mode and flick to auto ISO, letting the camera decide the settings for itself, which is something I almost never recommend. However, I've been incredibly pleasantly surprised with the performance of this camera for holy grail shots in aperture priority mode. As we can see on this exposure or brightness curve in LR time-lapse, there is no insane zigzagging up and down of the exposure. It is still a little bit flickery, but it's much more smoother than any DSLR, so that's really good news. Then next up there's time-lapse video mode, and this mode offers you full HD or 4K time-lapse videos where the camera shoots the frames and compiles it in camera. Sadly, it doesn't save any JPEG, HEIF, RAW or compressed RAW photos. It is purely a video file that you get out of it. I do not recommend using this mode because sometimes, and actually quite often when you use fast shutter speeds, the slightest wobble or jitter or wind induces this very strange image compression which I haven't been able to reliably replicate. It's hit and miss, and honestly it ruins your sequence unless you use slower shutter speed, so go below 1/100th of a second, and that seems to fix it. But then you obviously, you need to use filters, etc. I just don't recommend shooting time lapses in this video mode unless there's no other way or you have a specific use for it. That being said, this mode does feature an exposure leveling mode where it measures the light for every frame and gradually adjusts your settings for sunrise or sunset, aka a holy grail time-lapse, and this is what that looks like straight out of camera with no editing. As you can see, There is no to very little or very little to no flickering or exposure zigzagging, as we would call it. So take this mode with a grain of salt, or however you want to call that. It's good, not great. Ideally, for the most highest quality, you shoot everything as RAW files anyway. You can set a number of frames in this mode from 2 to 3600, which I assume has something to do with file size, because why else would you limit it to 3600? And your intervals range from 2 seconds, sadly not 1 second, all the way to 99 hours, 59 minutes and 59 seconds. Fun fact, if you combine the largest amount of frames with the largest possible interval, you will get a time-lapse video spanning 14,996 days, or just over 41 years. Should I give that a go? To shoot a Holy Grail time-lapse in time-lapse video mode, you flick the camera to aperture priority, you set your ISO to auto, frame it up and let it run. I do recommend setting your auto ISO max to something reasonable so that it starts ramping the shutter speed, which will top out at 1 second, by the way, before it goes into the crazy noisy ISO regions. I found usable ISO up until 6,400 in this mode for a very clean result. Then a third way to shoot time lapses is using an external remote, and my favorite remote is the LR Timelapse Pro Timer 2.5. I've made a video about it here, but I plan on making a newer video about it because there's some new firmware updates and I've just used it much more since I've made that video, so keep an eye out for that. A very quick intermezzo to announce that my ebook Passive Income for Creatives is currently on sale for the Black Friday shenanigans that are happening all over the world. 30% off using code BF2020. If you have a hobby and you feel like you want to make some money with it, but you don't know where to start or how to begin or whatever, check out my ebook. It gives you a framework to set up passive income streams so you can have a passive income system so you can make money passively. Anyways, let's keep going. Let's talk dynamic range. I think the dynamic range on this camera... Oop. Light's gone out. So, dynamic range. I think the dynamic range on this camera is fantastic, keeping in mind that I am coming from a 1DX2, a 6D Mark II, and a Lumix S1. I managed to push and pull shadows and highlights and exposure quite extremely. It's probably not as good as the Sony's, but don't quote me on that. I just thought it was very impressive how much information I could pull back or push back with some basic editing in Lightroom. Very important to note, the dynamic range and the low light performance really drops down when you use the electronic shutter. For some reason, this reduces the sensor readout to 12 bits as opposed to the 14-bit that we were working with usually. And for that reason, I highly recommend only using the mechanical shutter. If you are worried about ruining your shutter or shortening its lifespan, watch this video here. In short, you won't ruin your shutter, and even if you do, it's gonna be worth it. CR3, the new CR2, what a surprise. So you can shoot CR3 files in normal full-size RAW files, which is just the raw readout from the sensor, and you can also save compressed RAW, which is the same information, but half the size, slightly lossy. That being said, I found it very difficult to discover a difference in quality. I went back and forth between photos, and I'll put some on screen. I couldn't immediately tell which one was which, and that's great for someone like me who shoots a stupid amount of photos. If it's not a crucial, shoot for a client or for a big project, you might be better off just shooting this compressed RAW because it's literally half the file size and what appears to be almost the exact same quality. So very happy with that compressed RAW and in general with the new CR3 files. Speaking of file sizes, we also have the HEIF files, which is the high efficiency image format, I think it stands for. And look, here's the truth. I shot a bunch of them and I couldn't open them with any apps on my computer, so we're not going to talk about them because I don't know anything about them. All I know is that they are 10-bit versus 8-bit JPEGs, so pretty much you'll get less color banding, there's more information in there for similar file sizes. We've seen this format being used on iPhones and a bunch of other modern smartphones and cameras, and it's probably the format of the future, but for now, I'm sticking to JPEG as the other one because I just couldn't open the HEIF files. And then obviously we have the JPEGs, which we all know and love. They have the color baked in, the Canon color that we all know and love so much. Usually don't really recommend shooting JPEG, but I often shoot RAW and JPEG at the same time because the size is kind of negligible, and if you're in a time crunch and you want to quickly render a preview of your sequence, it's much faster to just render out the JPEG sequence that you've shot along the way. Also, if you're shooting the same resolution JPEG and RAW and you go to stabilize, for example, in post-production it's much faster to stabilize the JPEGs and then replace those JPEGs with the RAW files and then export your sequence. It's a quick little post-production tip for you. Right, let's chat resolution. So it's a 20.1 megapixel or 20.1 million pixel CMOS sensor. This is not a lot. I wish it was slightly more, like the R, around 30 megapixels, or the R5, which obviously has 45-ish megapixels. 20.1 megapixels is fine. I personally wish it was a little bit more, so do with that information what you want. The photos are 5,472 by 3,648 pixels, which means you can render high-resolution 5K time-lapse video files. If you want more, get a camera with more pixels. That being said, 5K video is more than enough for the majority of people. Usability. Bloody love using this camera. I mean, Canon is known for reliability, usability, ergonomics, the design. It all just works really well. Every little button feels right, fast to turn on, it's fast to operate, it's fast and great, and I love it. And I actually miss it. Since I've given it back to Canon UK, I miss having this camera. I'm now shooting on an S1 and an S5 and a 62. And I gotta say, I miss the R6, but I really want to try the R5 in the meantime. Up next, low light performance, aka high ISO performance. The camera goes all the way up to 204,800 ISO, which is high, but not as high as some of its competitors. I found the footage very very usable, up until ISO 12,800. Anything above that, you're going to really have to play around with some denoising, for which I recommend Neat Video's denoising plugin for After Effects or other software that you may or may not use. Dual SD UHS 2 rated card slots, which honestly is more than enough for me if you're shooting time lapses, unless you're shooting on burst mode and you'll fill the buffer real quick, which I sadly didn't test. Apologies. You won't be needing more than some fast SDXC cards, which, yeah, I've been using, and I have no complaints about the speed of these card slots. Once again, just a great Canon product. It's got similar rated weather sealing as the 6D Mark II, which has never let me down. And I've abused those cameras quite a bit. Because this is a loaner and it's my first time working with Canon UK, I didn't push this one too much. It did get caught in the rain, excuse me Canon, a little bit. But yeah, just let it air dry, blow off stuff from the lens and all the dials and buttons, and it's good as new. I think this weather sealing is probably best in its class. Battery life, probably one of the most important things for time-lapse cameras. So this camera comes with the LPE6NH battery, which promises 14% more battery charge than the previous model. It is rated, and this is funny, for 510 shots using the back LCD panel and 310 shots using the built-in viewfinder, which to me doesn't make sense, but anyways. Keep in mind that these numbers are for normal photography, where you're walking around and you're running and gunning and you're shooting and it's image stabilized and this and that. Time-lapse photography is different. We don't use image stabilization for the sensor or the lens. It's just sitting there on a tripod and it's clicking away slowly by itself. So let's have a look at what I was able to get out of one battery charge. In video time-lapse mode, a shot with 3,500 video frames used up 75% of the battery. In the same mode, a different shot, 2,000 frames at a 6-second interval with auto ISO, used up 46% battery. So that's pretty darn good. Then in photo time-lapse mode, 600 photos used up 25%. Another shot where I recorded 2,000 photos used up 30%. And then another one where I shot 2,600 photos used up 75%. So a little bit all over the place. Things that I did to improve the battery is to not use the viewfinder, to disable the back LCD by hitting the info button, to turn on the low power mode, to disable image stabilization, low light noise reduction, etc, etc. You can charge the camera via USB-C when it's off, using a USB-C PD or power delivery protocol charger. You'll be able to maintain the battery life while it's shooting. So if you're starting with 100% battery, you plug in USB-C PD, you will be able to shoot continuously. However, it won't charge. It'll only charge when you turn the camera off. This to me doesn't make a lot of sense. I hope to see that change in the future, and maybe we will. Fingers crossed. Quick tip, if you close the LCD panel thinking that you will save even more battery, the viewfinder pops on, even if you've disabled the viewfinder. So keep that in mind when you're getting ready for a long time-lapse shot. So overall, I'd call this battery life good, not great. It cannot beat a DSLR because a DSLR doesn't have a constant sensor readout like a mirrorless camera does. Moving on, rendering in camera like we can semi-do on the Sonys and which we can full do on the Lumixes, sadly non-existent in this camera. If you want to preview your time-lapse in camera, you have to shoot it as a time-lapse in video mode, which once again I do not recommend. So sadly, that is non-existent in this camera. Then, bugs. Did I find any bugs? Yes, that back button focus thing is very odd, where it says that it's triggering the camera and you can see the menu kind of freeze up and it's doing things and it's pretending to write things to the card, but there's no photos. I found this out the hard way when I was shooting a moon set and I returned to the camera as I was monitoring it from inside. It was shooting on the balcony. I see the thing, it's, you know, it's triggering, etc. But then I go and check the footage when the moon had set. Sadly, there was only one photo, so keep that in mind. I recommend customizing one of the custom menus, so if you are a back button focus shooter, just create a custom mode or program a custom mode where the back button focus is off and it's back on the shutter button, so that when you're shooting time lapses, you just switch to C1, enable your time lapse with the built-in photo intervalometer, and you're good to go. You won't have any issues. And then the only other bug I found, which I don't really know what it is, my 62 cameras have it as well, it's that weird image compression when shooting time-lapse video modes with fast shutter speeds. I assume it's got to do with how the sensor is read out in this mode. I've heard other cameras do it as well, so yeah, I don't know, maybe we need to start a global petition for camera manufacturers to fix that problem, which seems to plague a lot of other cameras as well. Alright, we're at the end almost. Conclusion time. What is my final opinion on this camera? I love this camera. I miss it a lot. I think it's an amazing bang for buck camera and it's a great all-rounder. It's not a great time-lapse camera. I would call it a good time-lapse camera. To make it a great time-lapse camera, here's 3 things that I would change. I would add a dedicated Holy Grail mode in photo time-lapse mode where it gradually and incrementally adjusts the settings. It's come close in aperture priority mode, but the camera is still assuming that it's just shooting photos and not a committed time-lapse shot, which is something that we do find in the S1 or the S5 or the Lumix cameras. I would also add a few more megapixels, maybe 24, 25, 26 megapixels would be better. And I would add the option to render time-lapse sequences in camera using the previews that are embedded into a RAW file or the JPEG files that you've shot alongside it. I think that would make it an absolutely fantastic camera. There's other benefits of shooting with a Canon. It's the fact that you have a stupidly large lens lineup, and if you're a professional, there's CPS, Canon Professional Services, which I think is often overlooked in these types of reviews. It's a great argument for professionals, having a professional support team globally that can help you and service you and get you gear loans, etc. like that. It's almost unheard of. So final conclusion, even though it's not the perfect or the greatest time-lapse camera, I think it's still a really good camera, and honestly I would like to have one. But first I want to try out the R5 and see how that one works with the built-in 8K time-lapse video footage, etc. What are your thoughts? Do you have an R6? Do you have an R5? What camera are you shooting on? Let me know in the comments down below. And yeah, if you're not subbed, please sub, etc. All that stuff that YouTubers say at the end. Check out my ebook, Passive Income for Creatives. It's currently 30% off for Black Friday, BF 2020, or hit the link in the description. If you have a hobby, you want to make money with it, you want to grow your following on social media, you want to figure out how this passive income stuff works that everyone's talking about with affiliates and referrals, etc. Have a look at the ebook. It's helped a lot of people. It's gotten a lot of 5-star reviews. And look, you support me by checking it out as well. So big thanks again. Also, yeah, members get downloads of RAW files, and that's it.